On a slightly deeper level, if one is habitually pleasing, they can avoid awareness of any other view of themselves. So this is just another interpretation of why someone behaves in this way. Because you could picture this. When pleasing, right, when agreeable, in their mind, they are the, and I quote, the good child or the good girlfriend or husband. And therefore, they never have to confront a more threatening and conflictual representation of themselves. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In a recent episode, we explored how increasing frustration tolerance and impulse control fosters effective communication. Through my work with couples, I've noticed that there are obstructions to communication, and therefore nothing is learned and nothing ever really changes. As I was discussing and giving examples of how these obstructions may manifest, I highlighted one common scenario of aggressive communication characterized by accusations. That example led me to think about another, much more subtle but equally damaging obstruction to communication and connecting. This is when you, or someone you may know, is excessively or overly agreeable. How is being overly agreeable an obstruction to communication, you may be asking? Picture this scenario. Your loved one, whether a partner or a close friend, consistently exhibits an excessively cooperative attitude. While on the surface, this may seem like an ideal trait. However, you might find yourself unexpectedly irritated or frustrated by their constant agreeability. You offer suggestions or provide guidance, perhaps on directions to a particular store, a simple task you've asked them to complete, or basic rules of driving. But despite the fact that they have heard you and agree, this person remains seemingly lost, distant, or oblivious. And by the way, this is the part that nothing changes. They don't really complete the task, or they complete it halfway, or they take a really long time and they disappear for long periods. So what I hope I'm beginning to make clear is why you might feel irritated. But let's delve a little deeper into your irritation or frustration. My experience working with couples or individuals in similar situations reveals a pattern. They seem to prefer mindlessly agreeing while remaining aloof, confused, or blind to any deeper understanding that their agreeability has an impact on you. Upon closer examination, it becomes evident that they opt for agreement to avoid the discomfort of genuine engagement, which inherently involves acknowledging differing opinions and feelings. This discomfort stems from a fear of acknowledging differences and separateness, which individuals with narcissistic tendencies, especially covert narcissists, struggle to tolerate. In other words, it's very challenging for them to tolerate these, what we call, typical separations of everyday life. A different opinion can be a separation. But why, you may now be asking, is there such discomfort about acknowledging these little differences, like a different opinion, a different perspective? This ties into how people with narcissistic traits oftentimes have caregivers who hinder their ability to develop independence. This leads to ongoing fears of being controlled and losing their autonomy. Caregivers who experience difficulty in accepting and fostering the child's assertive thrust into emerging autonomy, which, by the way, the child's thrust can take on the form of doing something, I don't know, like some sort of non-compliant behavior, kind of like what we call in my field an acting out, going against the rules. But what happens though, is rather than accepting or containing this, the caregiver can react defensively, get upset with the child, and emotionally withdraw from them, or get excessively angry with them and attempt to do what? What do? They attempt then to control the child's impulse to separate. And that's right. That's part of separation, is any kind of misbehavior. There are different ways to interpret it, but a child's misbehavior, doing something against the rules, right, is a way of separating, asserting their own autonomy. But the caregiver cannot tolerate that. So the child learns that to protect themselves from feeling controlled and dominated, this is, remember, the reaction of the caregiver, they may create a false sense of connection. It's like a sort of pseudo connection by either agreeing with everything that the caregiver, or in contemporary times, that you say, that their partner says, they just agree with it. Or alternatively, they may pressure you to always agree with their view of things. You see, as long as there's agreement, that's the most important piece, because when there's agreement, you're on the same page. And when you're on the same page, there's no separation. In other words, they can become whatever's necessary in order to survive childhood, right? They do whatever is necessary because they don't want to lose the love of the caregiver. But in doing this, their own identity is sacrificed. But they do this to survive, because every child needs some level of comforting and love. So what they end up doing, in essence, is they behave in a superficially compliant manner. And this happens for many reasons, a few of which would include that to get the caregiver's warm approval, right? Because they learn that they must be compliant, because when they're not compliant, remember what I mentioned a moment ago, the caregiver gets angry or withdraws their love, or they try to control them. So in order to not feel controlled and dominated, again, they become superficially compliant. Now, wait, hold on a second. Now you may be saying, if they're simply agreeing with everything, are they not being controlled? That's a good question. And this is a really important point. But I want to make clear that in this agreement, there's no investment. There's no real involvement in the decisions. Therefore, they cannot really ever feel controlled if, for instance, they are never really there. Let me just say one more thing about what I just said about number one, right? I said to get the caregiver's warm approval. Like, that's a reason that they may become superficially compliant. Getting this approval, what I've discovered is that they may also seek this superficial approval to avoid what they think, and therefore then they assume, right? Because that's just the way it works in somebody's mind, is that if you have a thought, you just assume it's true. But if they think this and then they assume that you're going to get angry with them if they disagree with you. This fear stems from this early experience with these caregivers that I mentioned a moment ago, who withdrew their love or punished them for asserting independence. So there's an assumption, you see, and this is not also conscious, by the way, but there's an unconscious assumption that if they disagree with you, you're going to get angry, because these early experiences from childhood, they get internalized. You see, they carry them around with them. And if you could believe that things that happen early in life don't disappear, they go inside of us, then you can imagine that they carry with them fears of retaliation, which raise to the level of vulnerability to abandonment, that they're going to be abandoned if they act in an authentic way, if they assert their own opinion. Okay, so in short, in adopting a stance of agreeableness, they can remain emotionally distant and they can cover the anxiety related to these things that we're talking about. Anxiety related to separation, abandonment, and or feelings of being controlled and dominated. In my work with these agreeable yet distant individuals, in part, the goal is to get under the surface and help them see that their need to please stems from this internalized relationship pattern of seeking approval from an emotionally rejecting caregiver whose superficial attention was desperately needed. In other words, they needed that. And they figured out a way to survive, right? By remaining superficially involved and compliant. This is what led to survival. Okay. On a slightly deeper level, if one is habitually pleasing, they can avoid awareness of any other view of themselves. So this is just another interpretation of why someone behaves in this way. Because you could picture this. When pleasing, right? When agreeable, in their mind, they are the, and I quote, the good child or the good girlfriend or husband. And therefore, they never have to confront a more threatening and conflictual representation of themselves, such as an angry child, right? Because we know that we're all capable of having multiple levels of feelings. So the compliance then and being in their mind the good one, they never have to recognize or think about how angry they are, or that they maybe did have an emotionally neglectful caregiver, or any other complicated emotions, right? I just mentioned anger, but there are many, many emotions that go on when one grows up in this kind of environment. So deeper analysis of this false agreeableness, analysis of this pleasing and lying, because yes, to some extent, this is lying as well. But this pleasing and lying disposition often reveals an attempt to create a more acceptable image of themselves in both their own mind and in the mind of the other, which might be you. This is the link to narcissism, to go back to narcissism. If you can imagine that this false presentation of themselves is also a retreat into omnipotence, because they, as I mentioned already, because in their own mind, they're good, right? They're the good child, girlfriend, spouse, right? They're doing it perfectly. This is part of omnipotence. And like any narcissistic omnipotence, this makes contact with the real world very challenging. And I've said this many times in prior episodes. Simple contact with reality, which is emotions and being involved in a relationship, having a thought, an opinion of your own, right? Being involved with you. This is a challenge to their whole defensive system. Like they have this whole system which is put in place. And that's what we need to get at. And that's part of the work that I do with these individuals. So let me go back to that then, to return to the work. Okay, to return to my work with these individuals, this is the nature of the work. The goal is to help them begin to see and understand how they are not really present and in contact with the significant people in their lives. One technique that I found to be helpful is what we call, and I quote, confrontation. Now, I don't mean an angry confrontation of their false or manipulative disposition. Well, perhaps that will come later because we do need to get into the more aggressive piece of this, the manipulative part, but we save that for much later. But for now, the confrontation is a pulling together of information that does not really fit together, is contradictory, or is conflicting. And you'll notice this, by the way, when you listen very closely to their stories. Like, for instance, I might find myself saying something like, I'm struck by the absence of anger as you describe the situation with your partner. It is natural to have such feelings, especially since she was so angry with you over the way you were driving the car or the directions. You could fill in the blank here. But yet you seem to avoid those feelings. See, you've told me about what a wonderful mother, wife, husband, boyfriend, whatever. Again, you could fill in the blank. But the point is, you've told me about what a wonderful husband you have, but virtually nothing about their limitations. Did you notice that? Or alternatively, you mentioned several times that your wife is upset with you. Can you tell me the details of precisely what's upsetting her? See, that's another good way to get at their behavior. Anyway, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there's something in their story that's missing or denied. And once this is identified, the goal is exploration of the motivation for and the meaning of this omission. Why did they leave this out? See, this is so important because this whole other side of their sense of self, all these other feelings get sequestered in a way or split off, maybe repressed, depending on the level of functioning of the individual. And that's what we need to start bringing back into their conscious level of awareness. This line of inquisitive questions is designed to help them see how they are suppressing their true selves in the hope of what? In the hope of winning love. However, as I mentioned earlier, love and closeness then become associated with the dangers of loss of their sense of self, right? The parent that doesn't let them live an independent life. So there's the danger of the loss of a sense of self, a loss of their identity through engulfment or abandonment or someone taking over, right? That's the controlling them that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, once we get this deep into the work, I might find myself beginning to wonder, could it be that you avoid such feelings because you fear that it will lead your spouse, husband, whoever, to withdraw or pull away from you? See, trying to help them become more curious. So first, we have to help them recognize the behavior. And then secondly, we help them become more curious about their behavior. In short, the goal, what I'm trying to do is what we're doing is we're addressing the illusion of connection and the fear of being alone or abandoned. And then this serves as a pathway toward genuine connection and emotional flexibility and freedom. And that's what we want. We want to free up all those other emotions that I mentioned a moment ago are either split off or suppressed in some way. Now, look, there's so much more to say about this. There's a whole nother piece, which maybe I'll pick up in a subsequent episode, but I just want to put it in here as something for you to think about. This level of compliance in my field, the field of psychoanalysis, what we call a false self, could also be their way of controlling you. You see, and this is also what leads to your feelings of irritation with them. How might this agreeability lead to them controlling you? There could be a sense, a deeper feeling that they pulled something over on you. In other words, they tricked you, they duped you. And in that way, it's almost as if there's like a victory, a sense of superiority, because they triumphed over you, but they really triumphed over reality as well. And that feels really good in the mind of somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics. But anyway, I just wanted to plant that seed as something to think about and as another sort of venue towards why you might feel so irritated or frustrated with them. Anybody might feel that way if someone has, again, this is not conscious, but someone has a victory over you by not doing said task or whatever it was you were helping them with. All right, we have to wrap it up there for today, but I hope our discussion shed some light on how excessive agreeability can obstruct genuine communication and connection, leading to irritation and frustration in relationships. I tried to demonstrate how such behavior often stems from a fear of conflict and a desire to avoid discomfort, which is rooted in what? In these early childhood experiences that I detailed with emotionally rejecting caregivers who don't let these children separate and develop a sense of autonomy. And this ultimately does what? It creates a pseudo connection while simultaneously an emotional distance, right? They remain distant. If you're interested in exploring more about the various aspects of narcissism, please consider subscribing to this channel for future insights. All right, until next time, as always, engage your mind, not your obstructed form of communication. All right, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.